Good morning. Happy Father's Day. On this Sunday, we are continuing our following of the Israelites in their journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. And today, we are going to start off in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. I'm going to do both readings here on the video. So I think they're both speak to this idea of being formed as a community. So Paul writes, "We put no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry, but as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, by great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, the Holy Spirit, genuine love, by truthful speech, and the power of God with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. Through honor and dishonor, through slander and praise, we are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold we live, as punished yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything." And from there we flip way back, Exodus chapter 20. We are starting in verse 18. "Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, 'You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die.' Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin.' The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold, an altar of earth. You shall make for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So in our house, we are big on directions. So if you can think of the flashlights, the directional pointers that they have at the airport, that the employees there use to guide the planes. So we have some of those, and Caleb will on occasion use those to guide us on our family walks. It's quite the amazing sight. But it gets me thinking about traffic signals sometimes, and the early days of motoring in America were fairly chaotic, right? Because the streets still had a lot of pedestrians, had a lot of cyclists, had people on horses in them, and so everyone was sort of vying for figuring out, who was going to go where, and it was all starting to move faster and faster, and so it was chaos. And then early in the 20th century, things began to be standardized. It was actually in Cleveland here that the first electric traffic signal was installed to regulate traffic on the intersections. And it was years until there was the centralized, the stripe painted on the roads to say which side of the road belonged to whom, which if you've ever driven in a car in Central America, where in many places it can be a very fluid situation about what side of the road you're driving on, and it can feel as though you're taking life into your own hands on some of those streets. You realize the value, perhaps, of that center line. But it was chaotic, but in order for us to all cooperate on the roads, we had to have a standard set of rules and signals so that we could share the road together. So people like us, people who were driving do things like this, observe these rules, such and such rules, so that we can get to where we are going as safely as possible. So the tribe is the people who are driving on the roads, and then the directive is following those rules. And so, it's not an entirely different situation than when we think about the Israelites in Exodus 20. So just as early motoring, they had this invention that had transformed life, and everyone was figuring out, how do we live together now? The Israelites had this dramatic transformation, right? 400 years in slavery, and then God dramatically frees them from slavery, and they go through the sea, which has been parted for them. Miraculously, the Egyptians are swallowed up behind them, and they find their way at Mount Sinai. And so for the previous 400 years, right, they had lived under the boot of the Egyptians, and they had no freedom. And so their way of living was defined by basically what the Egyptians told them to do. And so here they are now with freedom, and they have to figure out, how do we behave? How do we act? People like us, who have been freed from the Egyptians, what do we do? What are our behaviors? What do they look like? Right? How is our community that is now defined by freedom, how are we going to act together? And so here at Mount Sinai, God gives them the law, of which the 10 Commandments are the most famous part. And what we read is just after the 10 Commandments, but the law continues on after this as the people receive it. And it's easy for us to look back at the law and say, oh, that was so restrictive. But the people received it with gratitude. Because what the law did was it shaped their horizontal and their vertical relationships. It shaped their relationships with all of life, and everything they did, they had guidelines for how to live and how they were going to glorify God in the midst of that, because the community had been freed by God, and so they were going to be defined by their worship of God in everything they did. And so the law was the vehicle to allow them to do that. So all of life was governed by this, and it was received. And so people like us, for them that had been freed from this Egyptian slavery, are going to live like this, governed by the law and the grace and the mercy of God. So the law helped them to define themselves and their actions and their behaviors as the people of God. Now, granted, people started to break the law not long after they received it, so that brokenness of humanity continues as a thread, and that it's always a thread that runs through our history. What we're striving to do is infiltrated by sin, and so that brokenness is a part of our story. And all of this has got me thinking about Juneteenth, right? Our newest national holiday. So celebrating the end of slavery in the United States. And so on June 19th, 1865, the Union Army showed up in Texas, which to that point had resisted freeing the slaves. And so the Union Army showed up and announced the end of slavery in Texas. And so that is the celebration that we now have that has been going on, but we now have as a national holiday on June 19th. And so, I was thinking about how what happened in Exodus 20 didn't happen in June of 1865. And so sort of as I understand what happened is that the federal troops showed up, they announced the end of slavery. And then there were some laws passed, and the federal army remained in the South through 1877, at which point there was sort of this bargain made, and there had been efforts to undermine all of this since 1865, but in 1877 the federal troops left, and then there were all these restrictive laws passed to basically try and go back to maybe not slavery, but there was this air of discrimination and tribalism, and it was this idea that people like us, and at the time they were sort of sorting that by color. And I just kept thinking how in Exodus 20 you have this giving of the law as an effort to reshape all of the community after this dramatic transformation, and how that didn't happen in a thorough way in the United States in 1865. And And I was thinking about how life would have, could have, might have been different if perhaps it had, if we as a country had sat down and said, okay, let's define people like us as all of America. And then think about the things that we do. People like us do things like this. So if people like us is all of America, of every color, and the things that we do are honor and serve one another and enable everyone to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? If we enable that, and if we had sort of stepped on discrimination then and decided how we were going to live in a formalized way, perhaps we'd have a very different society today without that sort of institutional brokenness and the generational poverty that we so often see, and the divisions along racial lines that we're struggling with now. And perhaps had we sat down at a table and worked these things out then, maybe life could be different now. I don't know. It's thinking about that idea of people like us do things like this, and that us is so important. How we think about us. And so, in thinking about, here we are, right, a small Presbyterian church in Columbus, Ohio, a town of 2 million people in the 21st century, how do we think about this Exodus 20 idea of being reformed as a community? And when I think about it, right, our community is going through a transformation, right? Our society is, when we think about the connected online society and the impact of social media and the internet and how that is transforming society. It's remarkable. I don't think we fully understand all of this, but what I see often is this tribal sense of where it used to be the people on your street was sort of your tribe. Now you can sort of go online and curate your own and exclude people you would say are not like you. And it's very easy to do, and we're seeing, I think, certainly in Washington, the impact of how people are curating a tribe and sort of isolating their viewpoint or their lives from people who are different than they are. And I think it's a shame. And so I think, how do we as a small church, how do we as individuals expand that idea of community as a powerful antidote to much of what's going on in society? And so I want to invite you, maybe challenge you, for this week, for every person you come across, to think about what you have in common with them. Go spend some time walking up and down your street and stop at every house and think about what you have in common with them. And if you don't know that individual, maybe it's a great chance to get to know them, to listen to them, hear their story, because I guarantee that you have something in common with them. Right? Paul says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, so we can always start there, although it's not exactly the greatest icebreaker. But what's amazing is in this 2 Corinthians passage, you get the sense of the church sort of seeking to make connections, doing whatever they can to make connections in afflictions, hardships, calamities, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, right? There's all sorts of ways that the church was connecting with people, because the church was made up of a diverse group of people, and the church mattered. The church was relevant. Right? That's one of the greatest things about the church. The church is relevant to all people, even people in great suffering. The church is relevant. And so we have a message that translates into every scenario, in every walk of life. We can say, I'm like you. You are part of people like us. And so what a powerful message that we can take to the world, to the global community, is that the idea of the church, when we say people like us, means all. So people like us, what do we do? And this is the incredible thing. And so people like us who have been gathered by God, right? Who God is gathering back to God. You know, we are in awe and fear. And this is amazing when we think about this. Exodus 20 is the people saw God on the mountain. They saw the thunder and lightning. They were terrified, which is a common reaction. So do not fear. Is often the first message of the angels. The people were so afraid. that they didn't want to hear from God. They said, go Moses, be our intermediary. And so Moses goes and gets a message, but he says, do not fear, but yet let the fear of God guide you. And this is a different sort of fear, right? It's awe and wonder at what God is. And this is, we pick this up with the shepherds, right? On the first Christmas out in the fields, they have fear of the Lord. They're in awe at what God is doing. And so people like us are in awe of God and of the grace that, that God comes to us even in our failures and offers us hope for the future. And so truly, people like us, we find grace for our failures. We find hope for the future. And that's the message we can take to the world, is that all people can find hope and find grace. And so how do we share that message with everyone in this big community in which we dwell? People of every nation, people of every type, of every color. How do we share a message of hope and find grace for our failures? Find restoration in the love of God, and just be in awe of what God has done, of the healing that God offers. So, thanks be to God.